We're going to do a small share Hakdame on the Sugya of Matan Torah and Likkutei Sichos. This booklet is a compilation of different sichos that go through two main points that happen in Matan Torah. The first thing is the Chiddush of Matan Torah regarding the Chibur of Elmas Alyenim and Tachtenim, the connection between Elmas Aruchnim and Elmas Atachtim. And the second part of the booklet goes through the Chiddush of Matan Torah, which affected the Limud HaTorah. When a Yid learns Torah after Matan Torah, it's a different type of Torah than the obvious learned before Matan Torah. So there's just more like Dhamma. The Matan Torah was an event that affected a whole bunch of different things. Like we already learned in the past few sugyos, that one of the main things that happened in Matan Torah was that the Eibishter chose Yidden as a nation. The Eibishter chose Yidden, the Guf of a Yid, the Neshama of a Yid. Like it says in Tanya, and like it's brought down in Shulchan Aruch, that when we say Yavana V'Charta, the Eibishter told us that happened in Matan Torah. Also, Matan Torah is when Yidden became avodim to the Eibishter. Like it says that when Yidden were supposed to be taken out of Mitzrayim, in order that they should serve the Eibishter, Tavdun and Lakim al-Harazeh, that the Eibishter, the Yidden should serve the Eibishter, the concept of serving the Eibishter of Evet happened in Matan Torah. But these are all Chidushim and Negea to the Metzias of what a Yid is. Matan Torah was also Machadish, a Chidush Ikri, that a Yid could do a mitzvah, and with that mitzvah, after he does the mitzvah, the physical thing, that physical thing now got elevated until it could be a chayfetz hakdusha, it could be a holy object. Now, in order for that to happen, in order for there to be a chiddush, that a metzias gashmis, a physical object, should have a connection to kedusha, should be able to become holy, even though kedusha, holiness, and ruchnius and gashmis are complete opposites. But Matan Torah was chadash that they should be able to join together, and that the gashmis should be able to become holy. It says in the Gemara that the Avis were Makayim, or they did Kala Terekula. Kimo Avis Kala Terekula. Starting from Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu, he says, Beferish and Teredi, he was Makayim Mechnas HaSeichim. He was even Makayim Bris Milah. And the Gemara says in general, they kept all the mitzvahs. He baked matzahs, Chulam. So what's the difference between our mitzvahs that we do after Matan Torah and the mitzvahs that the Avis did before Matan Torah? In other words, what was Matan Torah in this Chadish on the Aveda of the Avis? It says, brought down in Chassidus, that all the Aveda that the Avis did, all the mitzvahs the Avis did, their main Aveda was Beruchnis. Their main Aveda was to serve the Eibishter in a spiritual way. And that which it did things Begashmis wasn't there to affect the Gashmis itself. It was either an outcome of the Aveda Ruchnis, or it was, like the Rebbe brings a few times, that their mitzvahs should be able to give koyach for after Matan Torah, Ma'aseh Avos Sim Labanim, since they gave us koyach. For our mitzvahs, they in their mitzvahs also had to have an union of Gashmis. So why were the mitzvahs of the Avis only Beruchnis and not Begashmis? So Chassidus explains that the mitzvahs the Avis did were all on their own initiative. They did it by themselves. Avraham Avinu was never commanded to do any mitzvahs besides Bismillah, but all the other mitzvahs he did, he was never commanded to do them. And since he was never commanded to do them, he was only able to be mamshich, he was only able to bring down the level of a lakus, which is the fi'erach, the metzias of a creation, the metzias of a nivra. And the nivra isn't able to reach higher than his makar, higher than his shadish. If he does something on his own initiative, by himself, he's only able to reach to the levels the way a nivra is able to reach. And that's why the mitzvahs of the Avis weren't able to mamshich a lakus dam magashmis. Like it says in Medrash, that the mitzvahs of the Avis are compared to reiches, to scents. And the smell of something has two pratim. Number one, the smell of an object isn't the object itself. It's something which comes from the object, it's ha'ara from the object. And that's why if a person has benefit from the smells of the Beis HaMikdash, or of Hekdesh, he's not chayv me'ilah. Because since he didn't have a benefit from the actual object itself, he only had the benefit from the scent of an object. The scent of the object isn't the object itself. And number two, regarding a smell doesn't have an effect on something. A smell comes and goes. And then when the smell goes, it doesn't leave anything there. It doesn't have a kiyum. And these two things are connected to each other. Before Matan Torah, the mitzvahs of the Avis were like smells, and they had these two concepts. Number one, they were only ha'ara. It wasn't amshacha from atzmos. since they weren't commanded on the mitzvah, so they only were able to connect to Arav Elokus. Because a Nivra, a creation, which is Mugbal, isn't able to connect to Atzmos, which is built in Mugbal. So the Keach, the obvious had, was only according to the Makan Nivraim. And that's why it wasn't able to have a Kiyum. It wasn't able to come down Begashmis. Because in order for mitzvahs to come down Begashmis, you have to have the Keach of Atzmos. And that's what happened at Matan Torah, that the Eibishter gave Keach to a Yid to Mamshach Elokus down Begashmis. Why does a Yid need the Keach, a special Keach to Mamshach Elokus Begashmis? Why did the obvious, since they did the mitzvahs by themselves, weren't able to bring it down Begashmis? So the answer to that is that a Nivra, the definition of a Nivra is something that doesn't feel Elokus. The definition of Nivra is Eilam Lashon Helm B'Hester. A limited Metzias means he doesn't have a connection to anything higher than him. And that's his definition. As opposed to the definition of Kedusha is completely the opposite. Kedusha and Ruchnius means that he doesn't have a connection to Gashmis. He's something which is Kaddish removed, separated from Gashmis. So therefore, in the Gedarim of Elokus itself, Elokus isn't supposed to come down to Gashmis. And Gashmis isn't supposed to have a connection to Ruchnius. They're two completely opposite concepts. Just like a Svara Sichlis has no connection to a stone, Elokus and Kedusha has no connection to Gashmi. And that's why the obvious through the Aveda weren't able to be Mamshech Elokus down into Gashmis. Because they were Mamshech Kedusha. But the definition of Kedusha was that it's not Nimshech in the Gashmis. So what happened with Matan Torah? In order for Elokus to come to Gashmis, they had to change the Gedarim and the way Elokus works. In other words, they had to be Mavatal the Gzeir between Elyenim and Tachtenim. And that from now on there should be a connection from El Elyenim to El Tachtenim. How does that happen? So that was only able to happen, it was Nizgale of a Darg of Elokus, which is higher than the Gedarim of Maila and Mata. And when that's Nizgale, you're able to have a connection between Maila and Mata. You're able to have a connection between a Nivra Gashmis, a physical Metzias, and that physical Metzias is able to become a Metzias Shakdusha, a Chefsha Shakdusha, until when the Sefer Torah drops on the ground, a person has to fast because the Sefer Torah is a holy Metzias. So what comes out from here is that the Chiddush of the Mitzvahs after Matan Torah isn't only that now the Elokus is able to be Nimshach Lamata. In other words, a new Shlab, the obvious Mamshach Elokus into a certain level. And we through our Mitzvahs and Mamshach Elokus even Begashmis. In order for that to happen, has to be Nizgala a whole new level of Elokus. A whole new dimension of Elokus that's higher than the Gdar of Maila and Mata. And that's what it says in Medrash, that before Matan Torah was the Gzeir between Eilim Salenim and Tachtenim. It was a Shomayim Shmayim Lashem, Vardas Nasan Livnei Adam. That which was the Gzeira is because in Elokus, that was the Gdar of Elokus. That Shomayim Shmayim Lashem. Kedusha is supposed to be Kaddish and Muvdal and higher than Ibrahim. And Vardas Nasan Livnei Adam. The Chiddush Matan Torah was Nizgala Dargan Elokus, which is higher than Elyenim and Tachtenim. And when that Nizgala, the Elyenim is able to be Nischaber with Tachtenim. And the Tachtenim was able to become a Metzias Shakdusha and be Nischaber with Elyenim. And like we see in Matan Torah itself, the Eibishter came down by Yer Lavar Har Sinai. The Eibishter didn't pick up Har Sinai to Shomayim. The Eibishter came down by Yer Lavar Har Sinai. And the Eibishter also told Moshe, well, Moshe Amar Alei, the Eibishter told Moshe to go up to Har Sinai. And the Matan Torah should have these two pratim, Sai Elyenim Yer La Tachtenim, Sai Tachtenim Me'al Elyenim. And this is the content that's brought in Chassidus a few times. The Rebbe brings it down in the gap to the Avraham Avinu's Makayim Achnat HaSerchim, when the Eibishter sent him Malachim, and Asher brings out that the Malachim didn't eat. They made as if they were eating, but they didn't eat. And if they didn't eat, then Avraham Avinu wasn't Makayim the mitzvah. The mitzvah of Achnat HaSerchim is to give food to guests, and then they should have benefit from it. Elamai, when you get to Avraham Avinu's Achnat HaSerchim, the whole point was that he should do the Aveda of Achnat HaSerchim. It's not the case that they should taka Havano. As long as Avraham Avinu does his Aveda, and he prepared the food, and he did the Aveda Ruchnis of Achnat HaSerchim, that was the mitzvah. And Yaakov Avinu was Makayim the mitzvah of Tefillin with Maklis, because the whole point of the mitzvah was that the Aveda Ruchnis was the mitzvah. It wasn't Nimshach into the Gashmis. In Me'ein Zeh, we have nowadays also the difference between the Yisur Deiraisa and Yisur Derabanan. Yisur Deiraisa is Yisur Shulchan Lechefze. The Chefze is something which is Aser, and therefore you can't do it. As opposed to Yisur Derabanan, since the Yisur Derabanan, they don't have the Koyach to Aser the Chefze by itself, this is that the Gavra should have a connection to that object. But that object, the Chacham can't make that object something which is Aser. which is al derech the mitzvahs of the Avis, that the whole Aveda was in the Gavra. They served the Eibishter mitzad their Aveda, but it didn't have an effect on it wasn't able to be put on the Gashmas the mitzvahs. Ad Kan is the way that the Sugya is brought down in Chassidus and in different Sichos. Over here we're going to explore, in the first part of the booklet, we're going to go through different Sichos that explain more about the Chiddush of the Chibur of Aleinu Tachtenu. Starting with the first Sicha, which is the Sicha in the Likkutei Sichos Chelik Tezvav, Parshas Lech Lecha. And the Rebbe starts explaining that even though we explained that before in Chassidus it says that the Avis didn't have this kayach of being Mechaber Aleinu Tachtenu. On the other hand, the Avis started with the Achana, started preparing for this Chiddush of the Chibur of Aleinu Tachtenu. And in the Aved of the Avis, you had the Achana, you had the Me'ain of the Chibur of Aleinu Tachtenu. And that was the Chiddush of the Avis over the Tzaddikim that happened before the Avis. And the Rebbe starts explaining with the mashal of a Rav teaching a student, a Rav and Talmud. The first way the Rav could teach a student is that the Rav teaches the student, and that the student has to understand what the Rav is saying. But the Rav doesn't teach him how to learn himself. The Rav doesn't teach the student a way to learn. He just teaches him the chayma that he's teaching. A second way that Rav could teach a student is that he gives the student the tools that the student himself should be able to learn himself and understand the subject himself. Now, each of these two ways have a ma'ila and chisaron. The first way that the Rav teaches the student, the ma'ila is that the student is tapping into a much higher world of seichel, higher than his own seichel. He's understanding the seichel where the Rav understands it. On the other hand, the chisaron is that the student isn't understanding according to his own capabilities. He's only understanding according to what the Rav is teaching him. And the second way, the ma'ila and chisaron is the other way around. On the one hand, the student is understanding with his own seichel, and the student is using his own intellect to understand the Dvar Seichel. On the other hand, since he's using his own intellect, he's using his own Seichel, that's obviously going to be Shlei B'erach, how the Rav is going to understand it. The ultimate way of the Rav teaching the Talmud is that the Rav influences the Talmud so much that the Talmud is able to think the way the Rav would think. Chushya Talmud nasa chushya Rav. That the Rav influences the Talmud so much that the Talmud himself, with his own chushim, since they became like the chushya of the Rav, is able to mechadish the Seichel of the Rav with a mechadish. These three things is a mashal of three tkufas before Matan Torah. The first kufa, which speaks about mainly in Parshas Bereshis, is of all the tzaddikim until Noach, from Adam Rishon until Noach, which even though they were big tzaddikim until Noach, all the tzaddikim's aveda was mainly mitzad hashpah that they were given milmayla. And that's where it says regarding Chanech, that even though Chanech was a tzaddik, but Kal B'daita L'Ashia, if Chanech got involved in the people of his generation, he would have been affected by them. Because Chanech and all the tzaddikim had told them, their whole tzidkus, their whole righteousness came from Nashbam and Maila, because they were higher than Elam Hazan. Which is al derech that the Rav teaches the student higher than the student's capabilities, so the student understands what the Rav is teaching him, but it doesn't resonate in the student's seichel mitzadatzim. And that represents the Aveda of Elienim. Then you have the Aveda of Noach Tal Avram. Regarding Noach, it says Tzadik Hay B'dei Reisa. Noach was a tzaddik in his generation, meaning he was involved with El Hazar Tachten. He was involved with his generation until he was pale, tried to be pale in his generation to do tshuva, which this represents the Aved of Tachtenim, the Aved of working with the world according to the Gdorm of the world. And that's why after the Mabel, one of the promises the Eibishter made to Noach was Lo Yosef Lo Yish Breisu, that the Eibishter is not going to change the chukim of Teva, which this shows on the Aveda which is connected to El Hazar Tacht. On the other hand, the Chisaron was that since it was Lifi Erech Tachtenim, it came with all the Hagbalas of Tachtenim. And that's why it says regarding Noach, which Mekatnei Amonahaya, that his Asagna Lakos was Be'ikir in things that Seichon Ibrahim can understand. When it came to Emunah and things which are higher than understanding, he was Mekatnei Amonah. Just like when the Rav teaches his Talmud, in a way that the Talmud should understand according to the Talmud Seichel. So the Talmud is only going to be able to understand the Seichel according to his own capabilities. Then you have the Aved of the Avitz, which beika by Avram. Regarding Avram, we saw the Aved of Avram on the one hand started from El Mazah Tachten, and it says, like the Medrash brings down, that regarding Avram Avinu, he used to bring rayas from Inyani Habriya, he used to bring rayas from the world and nature that the Eibishter exists. And like it's brought down in Rambam that when as soon as Avram started growing up, he started thinking and being chayke v'deresh how the laws of nature exist, which that shows in Tachtenim. But together with that, we see that regarding Avraham Avinu's emunah, it says, "Motzas levavi neman lefanecha," that Avraham Avinu took a lakus with the tmimos and with the emunah, just like Avid Pashut, which in Aveda that shows on a chibur of Elyonim and Tachtenim. Elyonim emunah, which is higher than Avodah Vasaga, and Tachtenim, seeing how the Eibishter is proven from El Mazat Tachten. And the reason why Avraham Avinu had this Aveda, because Avraham Avinu started Shnei Alafim Torah. Avraham Avinu started the Achana to Matan Torah. On the other hand, it was only Achana to Matan Torah. There's a difference between the Achana Avraham Avinu made to Matan Torah and Matan Torah itself. Just like we explained before with the Mashal of the Rav and Talmud, even though the third Eifen, that the Rav teaches the Talmud in the way that the Talmud's Chushim become the Chushim of the Rav, we can't say that there's a true Bein Areich, there's a true Chibur of Elyonim and Tachtenim. Because at the end of the day, the Talmud has to be a Bar Seichel. The Rav can't teach a stone. The Rav has to teach a Talmud which has Seichel already. And when he has Seichel, he could change his Seichel. This Seichel should think in a higher type of way. And even when the Talmud does think in a higher type of way, the part of the Seichel of the Talmud that was elevated is only a Seichel which was elevated. The Talmud mitzad atzmei, at the end of the day, without the Rav, he would never have understood such a thing. So on the one hand, there is a chibur of Elyonim and Tachtenim. On the one hand, there is a connection between Elyonim and Tachtenim. But that connection is only able to reach a Tachton which has some sort of shaykhs to be connected to the Elyon. And that's why Avraham Avinu's Aveda was only a chana to Matan Torah. Matan Torah was nischadish, that you should have a Metzias of Tachtenim which have no shaykhs to Lakos, a Metzias Gashmis, and that should connect to Elyonim. And that's only possible by a Darga of Lakus, which is higher than any Gdarim of Elyonim and Tachtenim, which is Nimna Nimnois. Neisa Havchim. On the one hand, you can have a Metzias of Elyonim. On the other hand, that Metzias of Elyonim can come down into Tachtenim, not Tachtenim which have some sort of Shaykhs to Elyonim. Tachtenim, She'ein Tachten, Matal Meno, take a Tachten that has no Shaykhs to Lakus and make that a Lakus. So what we saw from this Sikha was two pratim. Number one, we see how the Aveda of the Avis wasn't only, like we said before, Aveda Ruchnis, but in the Aveda Ruchnis itself, there already was a me'ein of a chibur of Elyonim and Tachtenim. And number two, we saw the difference between even that hachana to the Chiddush of Matan Torah. That Matan Torah was nischadish, that a Tachten that has no connection to Lakus whatsoever, that should be connected to Lakus. And that comes from Atzum, which is Ninda Nimnois. After we explained the first Sikha that the Avis itself had the hachana of the chibur Elyonim and Tachtenim, that's where we come on to the next Sikha, which is printed in the Likkutei Sichos Chelik Ches on Shavuos, which the Rebbe explains that a connection between Elyonim and Tachtenim is possible in two ways. Either you could have Amshach M'mayla Lamata, you can have Amshach of the Lakus, which comes down to Tachtenim, or you could have another way of Tachtenim connect to Lakus M'mata Lamayla, that the Tachten mitzad his own Aveda connects to Lamayla. On the lashon of the Medrash is HaTachtenim Yalu LeElyonim VeElyonim Yedel HaTachtenim. So even though the Matan Torah started the general connection of Elyonim and Tachtenim, the general chibur of Elyonim and Tachtenim, but Bepratis, more specific, Matan Torah only happened the first part. Matan Torah only was Amshach M'mayla Lamata. It says Matan Torah when the Eibishter came Vayedav Havayel Sinai, when the Eibishter came to Sinai, it says that Siper Leitzavach and Neif Leiparach, that the Metzius of the world stopped. The Metzius of the world became bottle. Because Matan Torah is Beker only Amshach M'mayla Lamata. Amshach that comes down to Nivroim, but it's Mevatel Nivroim. On the other hand, Matan Torah also gave Keach that a Yid with the Aveda are able to take a Metzias Gashmis of Elam Hazeh and make that into a Chetzer Shakdusha, make that into a Lakus. And that's the concept of Tachtenim Yalal Elyonim. And that Beker was emphasized in the Tkuf of David HaMelech. David HaMelech was Machadish two things. Number one, David HaMelech was the first king of the Eden. And number two, David HaMelech started to build the Beis HaMikdash. And these two concepts of a Melech and building the Beis HaMikdash both emphasize the concept of Tachtenim Yalal Elyonim, of making the world a Lakus. Because the concept of a Melech is that in Nivra, his whole Metzias is bottled to the Melech. Or in Alakus's terms, the whole Metzias of the Nivra is bottled to the Eibishter. And the chiddush of the Beis Hamikdash over the Mishkan was that the Beis Hamikdash, even after it was destroyed, stayed in Makom Kaddish. Because the chiddush of the Beis Hamikdash wasn't only because of the binyan, the building of the Beis Hamikdash. The building of the Beis Hamikdash affected the place that the Beis Hamikdash was built on, that place itself became a Makom Kaddish. Which these two details emphasize the Tachas HaShlemos of Tachtenim Yal Yonim, or Hamshachim Mata L'mayla, that the Nivra himself becomes a Likkutei. Which each of these two Efanim, like we said before, has a mile over the other. The Tachas HaShlemos is when you have in the same time, not in two different kufas, in the same time you have Sai HaTachtenim Yal Yonim, and Sai Yerim Yedel HaTachtenim. So after we explain the first two sichos, what the Chibur of Adenim Tachtenim means, and how that plays itself out in different kufis of Matan Torah, David, and the Baal Shem Tov and La'aseh Lavi. Now when we come on to the third sicha, which is a sicha from Parshas Lech Lecha Chelik Lamed Hey, where like a lot of other inyanim in the Rebbe's Torah, the Rebbe's machadish over what it says in other places in Chassidus. We see regarding Mesiras Nefesh, that which a Yid has a keach to go Mesiras Nefesh, has an interesting point. It says in Tanya that the keach, that which Yidden have a keach to go Mesiras Nefesh, is Yerush Olam Aviseinu. It comes from Avraham Avinu. Like we see, Avraham Avinu went on Mesiras Nefesh multiple times, and through that Pasach Hatzinu, the Yidden can go Mesiras Nefesh after Matan Torah. The question is, the concept of Mesiras Nefesh is the go Mesiras Nefesh for Torah mitzvahs. So how can we say that our keach to go Mesiras Nefesh comes from Avraham Avinu if Avraham Avinu lived in a time from before Torah mitzvahs? So how can his Aveda Mesiras Nefesh give us keach to go Mesiras Nefesh or something else, to go Mesiras Nefesh or Torah mitzvahs? And here's where the Rebbe's machadash of what we said before. Before we explained, in the other sichos we explained, that Matan Torah is machadash, that Nivroim, Tachtenim should have a connection to Elyonim, have a connection to higher elements. Over here the Rebbe starts explaining that the whole concept of there being a gzeira between Eilumis Elyonim and Tachtenim only applies to a dark of Elokos, which has a connection to Tachtenim and Elyonim. Like we explained before, the concept of a gzeira between Eilumis Elyonim and Tachtenim is that Kedusha is supposed to be Kodesh and Muvdal. So it's not supposed to come down to Eilumis. The Hagdara of Kedusha is that it doesn't come down to Eilumis. The Hagdara of Elyonim is that he's an Elyon, he doesn't come to a Tachten. And a Tachten doesn't have a connection to Elyon. But all these Hagdaras only start Legabi a darga of Elokos that has a geder of Elyon or a Tachten. But Legabi Atzmusi is Barich. Legabi a darga of Elokos which has no connection to the whole concept of Elyon and Tachten, obviously Legabi him you can't say that there's a gzeira between Elyon and Tachten. So the gzeira between Elyon and Tachten was only regarding a darga of Giluyim. Regarding the Etzem of the Eibishter, the whole concept of Elyon and Tachten doesn't start. So there was no gzeira between Elyon and Tachten. And just like in Mokim, Atmos isn't shaykh to the gather of Tachten and Elyon and Mokim. The same thing in Zman. Atmos is higher than any gather of Zman. So you can't tell me there's a difference in Elokos between Lifnei Matan Torah and Achnei Matan Torah. So what does it mean in Chassidus when it says that by Matan Torah there was a chibur between Elyon and Tachten? Legabe Atmos, there was never a differentiation between Elyon and Tachten. Elamai. The chiddush of Matan Torah was that Elyonim, the way they are mitzad Giluyim, and Tachtenim, the way they are mitzad Giluyim, in other words, the way they feel themselves, they should be able to connect and understand that they both come from Atmos. In other words, that the Etzem should be dead and be felt in Giluyim. And that's why the keach of Mesiras Nefesh comes from Avraham Avinu, and that gives us keach for mitzvahs after Matan Torah. The keach of Mesiras Nefesh we get from Avraham Avinu is from the Etzem and Neshama. And Legabe the Etzem and Neshama was always one with the Eibishter, say before Matan Torah, say after Matan Torah. There's no chiddush Legabe Etzem and Neshama. The chiddush that there is Legabe keach is a Giluyim. That after Matan Torah was given the keach that we should be mamshich the Etzem in the Gdorim of Elyon and Tachten, that the keach is like Giluyim should be able to feel how they are directly affected by the Etzem Neshama. So from here comes out that Legabe the Etzem of the Eibishter and the Etzem of Yidden, there's taka no chiddush Legabe Matan Torah. The only chiddush is Legabe Giluyim. That Legabe Giluyim now after Matan Torah, in other words, the Gdorim of Elyon and Tachten should be able to connect, and their Metzias is a direct continuation of that. So from this sicha, the chiddush comes out that the whole chiddush of Matan Torah was only how much the Etzem is in Gala, how much the Etzem comes down into Keches Giluyim. But Legabe the Etzem itself, there was no chiddush. And now that Legabe the Etzem doesn't have to be in Gala. the whole chiddush of etzem being nisgala means that it affects the keiches hagiluim. But the etzem by itself doesn't have to be nisgala. Adrab, etzem bulti nisgala, and etzem bulti mispashit. And that's how we come on to the fourth sikh of the booklet, which is from Parshas Ve'eda, Tafshinum Beis. The Rebbe explains that which by Matan Torah nisgala the etzem into keiches hagiluim isn't only a chiddush lagabe keiches hagiluim, that now they have a connection to the etzem, but it's a connection to the etzem itself. And this is a concept that Rebbe was mad a few times, that when the etzem is behelim and not nisgala into keiches hagiluim, that itself is kaviyach hagbala hagdara for the etzem. If you're saying that the etzem has to be behelim and isn't able to nisgala, isn't able to express itself in keiches hagiluim, so even though with Pashtos, the reason why etzem isn't nisgala is because it's higher than keiches hagiluim, but that itself, if you're saying that it can't come into keiches hagiluim, that means he's not the true definition of etzem. The true definition of etzem is that it doesn't have any definition. So if the etzem has to stay behelim, that defines him the definition that he's higher than gilim. When the etzem is able to be nimshach also lamata, so number one, it's a chiddush like keiches hagiluim, and now they have a connection to the etzem. But more importantly, that's a chiddush like the etzem. It's megala, the true potential of what the etzem is. That he's not defined and limited to even to the gdarim of what the etzem usually is defined by. And that's what is chadash Matan Torah. The number one, the etzem should be nimshach into the gdarim of Elyon and Tachton. They should be able to connect to each other because they hear how they come from the etzem. But number two, that was a chiddush even the etzem. That now was this gala that the etzem is not defined by any definition, even definition of being higher than definition. So l'sikum, the first four sichos is through 4 steps, 4 chidushim Matan Torah. The first sicha explains how in the obvious is a Aveda had already achana of chibur leinim tachtenim. Then we explain in the second sicha that chibur leinim tachtenim is in 2 ways. It could be mamayla lamata, which that was bika have Matan Torah of a leinim middle lamata, and then it could be an eifen of a mata lamayla, that the nivra itself becomes connected to lakus mitzad his own yeshida, and that was mudgish bika by David HaMelech. The true ma'ila is when you machaber both of them, which that's going to be lost in love. Then we had the third sicha that explained that the chiddush Matan Torah was only been negayat to giluyim. The etzem was always higher than the definition of Elyon and Tachton, so it's only a chiddush that the gabi the giluyim, they should their hair that they come from the etzem. And then we had the fourth sicha that explains that the whole goof of the etzem is this kala is a chiddush even the gabi the etzem itself. So that's the first chiluk of the booklet. The second chiluk of the booklet explains the chiddush of Matan Torah regarding the limud HaTorah, the learning of Torah after Matan Torah. But Pashtos, that which we should explain over here, the chiddush Matan Torah of connecting the Elyon and Tachton, is Beikim to get the mitzvahs. That now we can make the mitzvahs of the world elakus. But when we get to Torah, Torah is lachatchila higher than Eilamis. Apayim shana kol Torah leilam. Torah is lachatchila higher than Hagbalas of Elyon and Tachton. So the gabi the limud Torah, there's no difference between the obvious is learning Torah and a yid learning Torah. Maybe the gabi mitzvahs, you can say the obvious didn't have a keach to mamshach elakus lamata. That's one thing. But that which the Torah is the Eibish's chachma. So it's the same chachma before Matan Torah and after Matan Torah. So we're going to see in these 3 sichos 3 perspectives of differences between the Torah before Matan Torah and the Torah after Matan Torah. And that plays itself out in how a yid learns Torah b'peil. So the first sicha is a sicha from Chelik Tezvav, Parshas Vayeshev. Now the Rebbe explains that the Torah the Avos learned was a level of Torah which has an erech to nivroim. In other words, the Avos were only able to understand and grasp a level of Torah which has an erech to nivroim, to creations. Matan Torah is mechadish that the Eibishter gave us his Torah, not his Torah say. What does it mean his Torah? The Eibishter gave a nivra the opportunity to be able to understand the Eibishter's chacham which is higher than nivroim. So on the one hand, it's the Eibishter's chacham which is higher than nivroim, l'mayla ma'avana v'asaga. On the other hand, that comes down into Avana Vasaga, that comes down into the mitzvahs of a person. That's what it says, that right after Matan Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu b'tchila ya Moshe Rabbeinu le'im Torah u'meshakcha. Moshe Rabbeinu will learn Torah and he will forget it. Ad shenidlu matan, until the Eibishter gave Torah to him as a present. What does it mean Moshe Rabbeinu learned Torah and forgot it? The obvious didn't forget the Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu after Matan Torah, when he learned Torah, he straight away forgot. Why? Because the obvious learned a dag of Torah which has an erech to nivroim, and therefore was able to come into them b'primius, according to their level, and therefore they didn't forget it. Moshe Rabbeinu after Matan Torah was learning a dag of Torah which was higher than the get of Nivraim. So it wasn't able to come with premise, it wasn't able to resonate in the Mitzvahs of Nivraim. Ad shenidle matana, the Eibishter gave a yid. But matana, it's not something she gets to his abed. It's a matana, nothing alone as Torah say, the Eibishter gave us his Torah. On the one hand, he could be Metzias Mugbal. And on the other hand, that Metzias Mugbal is able to connect to something bligvul. And that plays out in the way Yid learns Torah after Matan Torah also. One of the main conditions when Yid learns Torah has to be with the Hagdama of Bittul. Has to be with the Hagdama of him not being a Metzias. Because if he's learning Torah the way it's connected to his Metzias, he's only going to be able to reach a level of Torah which is connected to Nivroi. In order for a Yid to connect to the Nesan Torah, that has to have the Hagdama of Bittul for him to be able to connect to the Nesan Torah which is Bligvul. That leads on to the next Sikha, which is a Sikha from the Shreir Sivin Chelik Chavches, which the Rebbe explains, even though we explained the last Sikha, that before a person starts learning Torah, he has to have a darg of Bittul, meaning he has to go out of his Metzias in order to tap into and connect to the Nesan Torah. By the end of the day, the Kavanah of Torah is not that you should be Mavato yourself. The Kavanah of Torah is to understand Torah with your Havana Vasaga, with your own Seichel, with your own Metzias. And that's the difference between Torah and Mitzvahs. Mitzvahs, the kavanah of mitzvahs is that you should be mevatel yourself. As opposed to Torah, the kavanah of Torah is that your mitzvahs, your seichel should understand Torah. And the Rebbe says that haba talia, through a person having bittul before he learns Torah, that makes him a kli that Torah, the way it's blig vul and the mailam me'avana vasaga, that should come down into his avana vasaga. So it's not that a person is mevatel himself and reaches the Nesan Torah and then he stays there. The kavanah is that he should bring this darga of the Nesan Torah, this darga of Torah, the way it's higher than Havana Vasaga, down into his Metzias, down into his Seichel, down into his Midas. That his Seichel and Midas should be nisyachid and be connected to the Nesan Torah. So on the one hand, you need the Agdam of Bittul. On the other hand, the Agdam of Bittul makes that a person, as a Metzias, as his Seichel and as his Midas b'fnei atzmei, that should be able to connect to and be nisyachid with the Nesan Torah. And that's why we see that to the Achana of Matan Torah, there were two things. On the one hand, in Shreir Sivin, the Yidden camped Ki'ish Echad B'leiv Echad, which is Madgish, the Maila of Achdus and Bittul. On the other hand, it says on the same day, Hischum Moshe Lis'asik Imoyim Be'inyin Kabbalah Satera, that together with the Yidden being in the Tnor of Bittul, Moshe Rabbeinu started dealing with them with the Inyan of Kabbalah Satera, of accepting Torah and bringing down the Torah into their Mitzias. And that leads into the last Sikha, which is a Sikha from Chelik Lamed Vav Parshas Yisrael. And the Rebbe explains that in Bittul there's two levels. There's one daga of Bittul is that a person is mevatel himself, that he as a Metzias decides to give himself over to the Eibishter. And then there's a higher type of Bittul, that the Eibishter reveals himself to him and that Rechameli is Batel. It's not that he decided to give himself over to Likkutei. Through the Gil of Matan Torah, Yid there heard, it was saw, and there heard that there is no Metzias besides the Eibishter. And that's why we say Matan Torah, the Eibishter Heireisa showed us that there's no other Metzias, but Shemaim Yamal, Einay, there's no other Metzias. And the Rebbe explains that these two, Dargis and Bittul, is in general the difference between Torah and Mitzvahs. Mitzvahs, when a Yid gives himself over to the Eibishter, it's called the Eved. A Yid does what the Eibishter wants, even though he's giving himself over to the Eibishter. But that's all as a Metzias being mevat himself to the Eibishter. Then you have the Bittul of Torah. When a person learns Torah, he's called a Melech. Man Malki Rabbanan. Why is he called a Melech? Because when a person learns Torah, the Dvar Hashem is speaking through him. Which that shows, it's not that he's a Metzias giving himself over to the Eibishter. There is no other Metzias besides Elikus. His Seichel and his Midas is thinking Dvar Hashem, and is speaking Dvar Hashem. They're speaking through him. So what Tzchadish and Nisach is, that not only is a person has to have Bittul, which is Achana to Limdat Torah, that which a person has to have Bittul, which is Achana to Limdat Torah, is all his Aveda. There's a higher type of Bittul, that's in Limdat Torah itself, that even though we usually explain that the difference in Torah and Mitzvahs is that Mitzvahs is Bittul, as opposed to Torah is a person's Mitzvahs. Over here the Rebbe explains that Adarabah, the Bittul of Torah is much higher than the Bittul of Mitzvahs. The Bittul of Mitzvahs is that a person as a Mitzvahs has given himself over. As opposed to the Bittul of Torah, that itself is a person's Seichel and a person's Midas. He doesn't have his own Seichel and he doesn't have his own Midas. His Seichel and his Midas are all thinking and speaking Dvar Hashem. And his Seichel, his own Midas, is called a Melech. And the Rebbe goes even further. That this Bittul, when he learns Torah, is Chayder and his Metzias, penetrates his Metzias, then even when he's not learning Torah, his whole Metzias becomes a Metzias of Elikus. So we saw in these three Sichos, in the first Sicha we saw the difference between the Torah after Matan Torah and the Torah the Avos learned. that the Torah of the Avos was all of Yarech and Ivraim, as opposed to the Torah after Matan Torah is an Ofen of Blikvul. Then we explained in the second Tziche that even though in order to reach the Dargam Nesan Torah, you have to have bittul before, but the Tachlis HaKavan is to bring down Torah, which is Blikvul, into your Metzias, and through the bittul before, a person's Metzias can be able to tap into this Blikvul. And the last Tziche, which takes this vart even more, that in bittul itself, there's two levels. The bittul a person does before Limdat Torah, that's all his own bittul. That's all his mitzias. The bittul when a person is learning Torah himself, that's the highest level of bittul someone could have. That his whole mitzias is saying Dvar Hashem and thinking Dvar Hashem. Not because he gave himself over, and therefore he has a mile of bittul, but because that's the mitzias. And that's why it's called Man Malki Rabbanu. As I saw in the book, we put 4 sichos that explain these two tnuas in Limdat Torah. Number 1, the tnuah of a person having bittul before he learns Torah. And number 2, then after he has bittul, the Torah has to come down into his mitzias, into his sech, into his midas.